What you're about to see has almost never happened in modern royal history. In the heart of Horse Guards Parade, Princess Beatrice arrived without warning. No grand escort, no ceremonial announcement. She stepped directly toward the red line of the household division and stopped in front of one man. She spoke to him, politely, clearly, but the royal guard didn't move. Not a glance, not a single twitch of acknowledgement. Why would a soldier entrusted with guarding Buckingham Palace stand frozen, even with a member of the royal family right in front of him? For long seconds, the crowd didn't dare breathe. Tourists raised their phones, veterans in the crowd whispered, and the tension began to crackle in the cold winter air. Was this a breach of tradition, a silent protest, or something far more disciplined? What happened next would prove that this was no act of disrespect. And yet, it still left the entire courtyard absolutely silent. Now, before we reveal the full story, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Late afternoon in London had a way of flattening the colours. The pale winter sun hung low enough to stretch shadows from the old government buildings right across the stone expanse of Horse Guards Parade. The light wasn't golden, it was a soft, tired silver, diffused through a high sheet of cloud that promised rain later. The air carried that faint mineral smell you only got in winter, part damp stone, part cold metal, and every exhale from the small gathering of visitors misted briefly before disappearing. This wasn't a day marked on the tourist calendars. There was no band assembled for the changing of the guard, no choreographed march of an entire division. It was one of the quieter ceremonial days, the sort usually only noted by insiders and the occasional lucky passerby. The forecourt wasn't empty, but the crowd was sparse enough that you could pick out individual conversations, hear the echo of your own steps on the paving stones. Those who were here leaned casually against the rope barriers, some with cameras hanging ready around their necks, others with phones in hand, more out of habit than expectation. A French couple spoke in low tones, near the south end of the barrier, pointing now and then at the scarlet line of uniforms. A man in a waxed jacket with a paper coffee cup glanced at his watch, then at the narrow side archways. He had the alert posture of someone waiting for something specific. The ceremonial guards themselves stood as they had been trained to stand, each an unmoving figure of red wool and black bearskin, rifles held at that precise angle where the butt sits squarely on the paving, and the barrel runs straight up past the right cheek. The boots were black enough to mirror the light, the brass fittings on their belts polished to a bright gleam that caught the occasional shaft of sun when the clouds shifted. They didn't sway, they didn't blink visibly. That 1,000-yard stare, fixed somewhere beyond the present moment, was a hallmark of the post. It wasn't arrogance and it wasn't indifference. It was the discipline of shutting out everything except the job. Every so often, a muffled sound from beyond the parade ground made its way into the quiet, the distant clop of hooves from the cavalry exercise yard, the clink of harness buckles, the faint creak of leather under weight. Occasionally, the breeze teased at the plumes on the bearskins or tugged at the rope barriers, making them sway just slightly. Some visitors tried to draw the guards' attention, a half-hearted wave from a child, a raised camera held higher for a better angle, but nothing broke the stillness. On a day like this, the scene was as much about absence as it was about action. There were no speeches, no crowds surging forward for a better view, just the quiet authority of men standing in line, holding a tradition that had outlasted countless shifts in the world beyond these walls. It was into this measured, almost fragile quiet that the first unexpected sound intruded, the low hum of an approaching engine, deeper and smoother than the usual service vehicles that sometimes crossed the far end of the ground. Heads turned slightly, eyes searching for the source. But the guards did not so much as twitch, for now the line held, red and black against pale stone, with the kind of calm that didn't ask for attention, but demanded it all the same. Third, from the left in the ceremonial line, stood Sergeant Alistair Grant, his profile as still and defined as if someone had carved him out of stone. At first glance, There was no reason to single him out from the others. Every man in the line wore the same perfectly pressed scarlet tunic, the same tall black bearskin that added nearly a foot to their height, the same polished boots that gleamed even in the dim London light. But if you lingered, you'd notice something in the way he held himself, an exactness that wasn't just from drill, but from habit honed over years. Grant had been in uniform since he was 19. Now approaching his late 30s, his career had been a mix of combat tours and ceremonial duty, each shaping the other in ways most civilians couldn't see. 2 tours in Helmand province, during some of the hardest fighting, had burned discipline into him at a level that went beyond rules. In the heat and dust of those deployments, the smallest lapse, a glance in the wrong direction, a moment's inattention, could mean not coming home. He remembered those days not as tales to impress, but as lessons he carried into everything he did. Standing a ceremonial post in central London might seem like an entirely different world, but to Grant, the core principle hadn't changed. You hold your position until ordered otherwise, and you do it with absolute focus. Within the regiment, Grant had a reputation, exacting to the point of immovability, the sort of man who didn't just follow the rules, but treated them as the architecture that kept everything standing. Some called it stubbornness, others called it reliability. To his mind, it was neither. It was simply doing the job properly. There were stories among the younger guardsmen about him, how he once stood 12 hours in the pouring rain during a state visit without shifting so much as his weight from one boot to the other. How, during a summer ceremony when the heat was enough to make even seasoned soldiers fight dizziness, he'd stayed perfectly upright, never loosening a single button until the relief came. How he once corrected a fellow guard, a friend even, for the smallest breach, answering a tourist's offhand question with a nod. It wasn't about being unkind, it was about the standard. He told that same friend later in the mess, the moment you start making exceptions, you open a door you might not be able to close. You bend for a harmless reason one day, and the next you're bending because someone with influence wants you to. That was the thing about protocol. It protected everyone equally, from the newest recruit to the highest-ranking royal. Grant also carried something else from his years of service, a quiet, steady pride in the traditions he now represented. He'd seen enough of the world to know that ceremonies like these weren't just for tourists. They were living symbols, part of a chain that connected the present to centuries of history. His job wasn't performance art, it was stewardship. As he stood in line that day, rifle gripped exactly where it should be, boots locked at the correct angle, his mind ticked over the usual observations. The wind's slight shift from the east, the faint vibration through the stone under his feet from the cavalry exercises, the sound of the crowd at his periphery. Nothing in those signals prepared him for the movement that was about to draw the attention of everyone on the parade ground. But whatever it was, he knew this. Unless the order came from the right place, in the right way, he would not move. It was not defiance, it was discipline. The first sign was the sound, not the rattling diesel of maintenance trucks or the throaty growl of cavalry lorries, but a low, composed hum that suggested weight and money. It came from the west, rolled softly across the open space of Horse Guards Parade, and settled beneath the winter air like a steady hand on a shoulder. A black SUV slipped into view along the perimeter road, windows dark enough to erase faces. It didn't announce itself with a siren or outrider. It simply appeared and moved with a kind of measured confidence that said it belonged here, even if today's schedule hadn't been written around it. A second vehicle followed, shorter, sleeker, the paintwork so immaculate it mirrored a ribbon of dull sky across its flanks. The pair travelled together unhurried, as if time itself would make space. Heads turned along the rope line. Cameras rose, reflexively, then hesitated, unsure whether this was footage worth capturing or an ordinary slice of official life. The guards did not react. The red line held, as it always did, still vertical, absolute. The first SUV continued on, claiming a shadowed edge beside an archway. The second slowed near the midpoint of the ceremonial line, far closer than visiting cars usually dared. Doors opened with soft, expensive clicks. 2 people stepped out first. Plainclothes aides in tailored coats, whose cut was as careful as their movements. They didn't strut, didn't fuss, didn't wave credentials. They simply looked. The scan took in the crowd, the spaces between barriers, the mounted troop idling at distance, the fixed faces beneath bearskins. One aide touched a discreet earpiece. The other raised 2 fingers to a third presence still inside the car. From the rear, a woman emerged. Her coat was navy and neatly belted, the kind of garment that looks practical until you notice the hand stitching at the seams. A simple scarf was tucked tight against the cold auburn hair gathered low. There was nothing jewelled, nothing ostentatious. No sash, no insignia, no flash of royal hardware that would anchor her in a newspaper photograph. She closed the door herself with a measured push and stood for a heartbeat with her gloved hands together, as if deciding which path to take. Princess Beatrice. Those who knew at once. Recognition moved through the rope line in little pockets. A surprised murmur from the French couple. A quiet "oh" from the man with the coffee. The quick, appraising glance of the veteran with the poppy pin who shifted his weight the same way men do when their habits tell them 2 steps ahead. Others weren't certain. It was the hair, perhaps, or the posture, or the ease with which the security bubble around her seemed both present and politely invisible. What was unusual wasn't her presence. Royals passed through these spaces more often than tourists realised. What was unusual was the route. There had been no heralding adjustments, no prearranged clearance down the ceremonial line, no subtle ripple of command moving ahead of her to create a seam. On days when a royal meant to cross the forecourt, a quiet choreography preceded them. A radio message, a lieutenant's nod, a half-pace shift in formation so that the ancient pageant and the living person could intersect without friction. None of that had happened. Beatrice spoke to the nearer aide in a tone that didn't carry. He inclined his head, then advanced toward the line with a step practiced enough to look informal. The second aide drifted to the side, the way water finds the edge of a stone. A third person, a palace staffer rather than security, judging by the thin folder clamped under one arm, hovered in the near background with a tentative expression that said he hated surprises but knew they were part of the job. Across the stone, Sergeant Alistair Grant registered the movement at the very edge of his attention. Not the identity, not the intention. Those belonged to another layer of the world he wasn't permitted to touch while on post. What he registered were the vectors, the line from the sedan to the gap between him and the next guard, the way the aide's approach angled, not to pass by the formation, but to cut through it, the distance shrinking in even confident steps. The mounted officer at the far side of the ground eased his horse into a slower circle, not so much approaching as making himself proximate. The small decisions of experienced people accumulated without words. A trooper reined in to clear a sight line. A palace photographer lowered camera, uncertain if this was a moment to capture or to let pass unrecorded. The wind lifted the edge of Beatrice's scarf. She settled it with a gloved hand and continued forward. A teenage boy near the barrier asked, half whisper, half breath, "Is that—" His father said, "I think so, but didn't sound entirely sure." Beatrice's pace was neither brisk nor tentative. She walked like someone used to moving through spaces arranged for other people, unbothered by the lack of ceremony. Closer now, her features were unmistakable, even without the language of regalia. The aides matched her cadence by instinct, the way fish keep their distance in a shared current. They reached a point where 3 paths presented themselves, skirt the formation entirely by taking a longer bend toward the archway. Pause and wait for an officer to clear a lane by radio or request a small adjustment in position from the nearest guard. The fastest option was the third. It was also the one that brushed against the grain of the rules. The nearer aide chose it. He stepped the last pace to the invisible line civilians seldom cross and spoke with a voice calibrated to be heard without being broadcast. The words didn't travel far, but they were clear to anyone within a few meters. A request for a 2-pace shift to open a neat passage for the princess and her small entourage. The crowd didn't yet feel the hinge turning, but it's funny how people sense impending significance. Phones rose a little higher. A woman in a camel coat leaned forward with a knit of concentration. The veteran's eyes moved once, left to right, measuring the portion of the line that would have to flex. At the perimeter, a constable's hand rested lightly on a radio he didn't key. The aide waited a beat, perhaps expecting the practiced accommodation that happens a dozen times a year when plans adjust. The practiced accommodation did not come. The red wall remained the red wall, and Sergeant Alistair Grant remained a precise element within it, vertical, silent, exact. Beatrice, watching, made no sign of impatience. She simply held the moment, the way a person holds a ribbon of music, as if listening for the next note. The aide glanced back, the smallest crease of uncertainty appearing at the corner of his mouth, then turned again toward the figure who did not and would not acknowledge him. Nothing abrupt had happened yet. No raised voices, no orders barked across stone. But the geometry of the afternoon had changed. The shortest line between arrival and destination now ran through a tradition older than everyone present, and the tradition had not stepped aside. Somewhere behind the bearskins, a bell pealed the quarter hour. The sound arced up, bounced off old brick and glass, and faded into the pale sky. Princess Beatrice adjusted her gloves with a gentle tug on each cuff, as if to anchor her hands. Then she took the final 2 steps that brought her within polite speaking distance of the immovable man in scarlet. The parade ground held its breath. The aide was the first to speak. "Sergeant, shift 2 paces right to allow access." His tone was practiced, courteous, clipped, and used to being obeyed without hesitation. Sergeant Grant didn't flinch. The rifle stayed where it had been all afternoon, barrel upright, butt square to the stone. His gaze remained locked on the middle distance, a line that seemed to pass straight through the princess, standing in front of him without registering her at all. The aide waited just long enough for it to become clear there would be no reply, then spoke again, this time sharper. "2 paces right, please, immediately." Nothing. Not a twitch of the shoulders, not the smallest turn of the head. The difference between the 2 silences was subtle. The first could have been a pause before compliance. The second was active, deliberate. A stillness that meant the answer had already been decided. Beatrice took a small step forward, closing the gap until she stood close enough to see the fine stitching on the brass buttons of his tunic. Her voice was lighter than the aide's, pitched more for conversation than command. "Could we pass through here, please?" The request carried an easy warmth, the kind of tone that might draw a smile in any other context, but Grant's expression did not change. His breathing didn't quicken, his shoulders didn't shift. If her words reached him, they left no mark visible to anyone watching. From behind the rope line, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman in a wool hat leaned toward her companion. "Why isn't he moving?" The man shrugged. "Maybe he's not allowed." An American tourist lifted her phone, whispering into the microphone. "She's talking to him, but he's just standing there." One of Beatrice's aides glanced at the other, the silent exchange between them carrying its own message. This wasn't going as expected. The second aide took half a step forward, lowering his voice. "They can hear you," he murmured to Beatrice, "but they're trained not to respond unless—" He hesitated, eyes flicking to Grant's rigid form. "Unless certain conditions are met." Grant's posture did not waver. From his point of view, there was nothing to weigh or decide. No order had come through the proper channel. And without that, he was the fixed point around which everything else must move. The longer he stood unmoved, the louder the rest of the world seemed to become. The wind tugged again at the princess's scarf. A mounted guard in the distance shifted in his saddle, the creak of leather carrying across the open space. Somewhere, a child laughed briefly before being shushed. Beatrice's expression didn't harden, it deepened. She tilted her head slightly, not in frustration, but in something closer to curiosity, as though the man in front of her had become a puzzle she was now inclined to solve. The aide's voice returned, firmer now. "Sergeant, this is Her Royal Highness." But the words were cut short by the reality that titles made no difference to the man on post. Not here, not in this uniform. From the crowd, a quiet voice, the veteran with the poppy pin, said to no one in particular, "He's not being rude. He's just doing what the book says." If Grant heard it, there was no sign. The line remained the line. And for the first time since she'd stepped from the car, Beatrice's smile faded just slightly shy. Not from offence, but from the realization that this might not be resolved the way most encounters in her life had been. The moment had shifted from a quiet formality to something taut, like the air before a storm. Nothing dramatic had happened, no raised voices, no gestures, yet every person within sightline knew they were watching something outside the ordinary rhythm of the parade ground. From behind the rope barrier, the murmurs thickened. A man in a quilted jacket leaned forward for a better look. "That's Beatrice, isn't it?" he whispered to the woman beside him. She narrowed her eyes. "I think so, but why isn't he moving?" A younger voice chimed in from just down the line. "Is he even allowed to ignore her like that?" One of the veterans in the crowd, tall, broad-shouldered, with a poppy pin on his lapel, turned his head slightly toward them. His voice was low, but it carried in the quiet. "He's not ignoring her. He's on post. Until an official order comes through, he's not permitted to move. Doesn't matter who's asking." A middle-aged American tourist, filming with her phone, glanced up from the screen. "Even for a royal?" "Especially for a royal," the veteran replied without missing a beat. "Protocol protects them as much as it protects him." Near the middle of the barrier, a boy of about 10 tugged at his father's coat. "Dad, why won't the soldier help her?" The father crouched slightly so his son could hear him without shouting. "Because sometimes doing the right thing means treating everyone the same. If he moves for her, without the proper signal, then the rules don't mean anything anymore." The boy frowned, processing that, while a few paces away, an older woman muttered under her breath, "Seems a bit stiff to me. She's family." The aides were talking quietly now, heads bent toward each other. Their body language was tight, weight on the balls of their feet, eyes flicking from the princess to the guard, to the mounted officer across the ground. One of them gestured subtly toward the archway, clearly weighing whether to route her around instead of through. A palace staff member with a slim leather portfolio hovered just inside the arch, as if debating whether to step forward. He didn't. His eyes, like everyone else's, stayed fixed on the line where nothing was moving. The wind carried the distant sound of hooves from the far side of the complex, the measured clop echoing against stone. A mounted trooper adjusted his reins, the metal bit clinked softly. Small sounds stood out more now, as though the stillness between Beatrice and Grant had drained colour from the rest of the courtyard. Beatrice herself showed no signs of frustration, but the curiosity in her expression had taken on weight. She studied the guard without speaking, hands clasped loosely in front of her, while her aides shifted their stance in subtle readiness. And somewhere in the back of the watching crowd, a quiet conclusion was starting to take root. Whatever was happening, it wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. The measured clop of hooves grew louder. From the far edge of the parade ground, a mounted officer in the dark blue of the household cavalry eased his horse toward the scene. He didn't rush, didn't cut across the open space with urgency. Instead, he traced a slow, deliberate path along the perimeter, his eyes moving between the princess, the aides, and the line of scarlet uniforms that remained as rigid as a painted backdrop. When he drew near, he reined in to a halt a few paces from Beatrice's position. The horse shifted its weight, one hoof striking the stone with a sharp, solitary sound. The officer swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, handing the reins to a waiting trooper who had appeared as if conjured. He approached on foot, removing his gloves as he walked the last few yards. His gaze lingered on Grant for a fraction longer than etiquette required, as though confirming what he already suspected. Then he leaned slightly toward the nearest aide, speaking in a tone meant for discretion. "He's not ignoring her," the officer said, his voice low but carrying just enough to reach the ears of a few bystanders. "He's following the book exactly." The aide tilted his head, brows knitting. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning," the officer replied, "that unless a formal order has been relayed through the chain of command, or she's here in an official, recognizable capacity, he is not permitted to alter formation or acknowledge her directly, not even a glance, not even a nod." The aide frowned. "She's a princess." "Which is why," the officer said evenly, "the rule matters. If he moves for her without the proper signal, it sets a precedent. The guard line isn't meant to read minds or interpret intent. They follow protocol so no one can misuse it, intentionally or otherwise." The words hung there for a moment. The aide looked toward Beatrice, perhaps wondering whether to relay the explanation. He didn't have to. She had been watching the exchange closely, and though she couldn't have caught every word, the gist was clear from the officer's expression and tone. Her eyes flicked back to Grant. Whatever puzzle she'd been working through in her mind seemed to resolve in that instant. The faintest smile touched her lips, not amused, but understanding. Around them, fragments of the officer's explanation began to filter through the crowd. A man in the camel coat whispered to his partner, "So he's not being rude, he's doing his job." "That's right," the partner replied quietly. "And by the looks of it, doing it very well." Even the mood among the aides shifted slightly. The tension in their shoulders eased, though their stance remained formal. The mounted officer gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say the situation had been read correctly and could now be. Allowed to end gracefully. It was, in its own way, a turning point. The earlier uncertainty in the air began to dissolve, replaced by something closer to quiet respect. Not just for the princess's patience, but for the fact that a guard on duty would hold the line even when the person in front of him carried a royal title. For a long moment, Beatrice didn't move. She stood there with her hands lightly clasped in front of her, eyes fixed on the motionless figure of Sergeant Grant. If she felt the cold, she gave no sign. If she was aware of the murmurs running through the crowd like ripples across still water, she didn't acknowledge them. Her focus was entirely on the man who, by not moving, had just shown her a truth about the institution she represented. Slowly, she took a single step back. The aides on either side shifted with her, small, reflexive adjustments born of habit. Her gaze flicked toward the mounted officer who had explained the situation, and she offered him a slight smile, one of recognition rather than dismissal. Then, turning back toward the aides, she spoke clearly enough for those nearest to hear. Her voice carried a warmth that was almost conversational, but with the kind of clarity that made it travel. "That means," she said, glancing briefly toward Grant, "he's doing it right." The words were simple, but they landed with a quiet weight. The nearest tourists exchanged looks. A woman in the front row smiled. The veteran with the poppy pin gave a short, approving nod. Even those who hadn't heard the officer's explanation seemed to understand now. The guard's stillness wasn't obstinacy. It was duty, lived to the letter. Grant did not react. He did not acknowledge the comment, did not shift his posture. To do so would have broken the very protocol she had just praised. That was the point. Beatrice let her eyes rest on him for another heartbeat, then turned to her right, gesturing lightly toward the long route around the end of the line. "Let's go the long way," she said to her aides, her tone light, almost amused at the prospect. There was no trace of irritation, no sense of being slighted. If anything, there was a note of approval, the unspoken understanding that traditions like this were only as strong as the people willing to enforce them without exception. She set off toward the far end of the formation, her small entourage falling into step. The mounted officer moved discreetly to shadow her from a distance, the reins of his horse held loosely in one hand. As they walked away, the tension that had gripped the courtyard seemed to loosen. Conversations resumed at a lower volume. The sound of the princess's footsteps faded into the steady rhythm of the guard's unbroken watch. Grant remained exactly as he had been since the moment the car first rolled into view, upright, rifle fixed, gaze locked forward. The only evidence that anything unusual had happened was the quiet change in the crowd's expressions. The princess and her aides disappeared beneath the stone archway at the far end of the parade ground, their figures swallowed by the shadowed passage beyond. The mounted officer followed at a measured distance, his horse's hoofbeats fading until they blended into the low background murmur of the city. For a moment no one moved. The guards stood as they always did, fixed in their posts, unyielding in their watch. The stillness returned, but it was a different stillness than before, one weighted with the knowledge that something unplanned had passed through it. Along the rope barrier, the crowd began to breathe again. A few conversations picked up, tentative at first, then growing more certain as people tried to put into words what they'd just seen. "That's how it's supposed to be done," the veteran with the poppy pin said, his tone as firm as if he were back on the drill square. A young man beside him, still holding his phone aloft, lowered it slowly. "So, he was right?" "He was right," the veteran said simply, and she knew it. Near them a mother knelt, so her young son could hear her over the ambient noise. See, sometimes respect means not giving someone special treatment. That way, the rules protect everyone. The boy looked thoughtful, eyes still fixed on the guard who hadn't moved a muscle through the entire exchange. So he was protecting her too? "In a way, yes," she said, with a small smile. Down the line, a middle-aged couple discussed it quietly in French. A man in a dark overcoat, perhaps a civil servant on his lunch break, remarked that such discipline was rare and worth keeping. There were a few dissenters, a muttered comment that the guard should have shown some flexibility, but they were quickly outnumbered by voices expressing quiet admiration. None of this reached Grant, or if it did, he gave no sign. His world, for the duration of his post, was a straight line of stone and sky and the weight of the rifle in his hands. He didn't need to know the outcome of the conversation. His duty wasn't to win approval, it was to hold the line. The princess's comment, "He's doing it right," lingered like an afterimage in the minds of those who had heard it. People pulled out their phones to send quick messages, some to friends, some to family. A few took slow, deliberate photographs of the guard line, no longer seeing it as static pageantry, but as something living, something tested and proven in front of them. By the time the last of the casual onlookers drifted away, the parade ground had returned to its quiet winter rhythm. The red line of uniforms remained unchanged as the shadows lengthened across the pale stone. Whatever lesson had been taken from the moment would leave with the witnesses. For Grant, it was just another post, another day done right. So what do you think? Should a royal guard ever adjust protocol for a member of the royal family outside of an official ceremony? And was Princess Beatrice right to praise the guard for holding his post, even when it meant making her take the long way around? Drop your thoughts in the comments, Moors. We read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, tap the like button, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss tomorrow's video. And if you know someone who would appreciate this moment of quiet respect for tradition, share it with them. Another Royal Guard story is waiting for you on screen right now. Click it and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another true moment that proves discipline is its own form of respect.